Studies in Occultism by Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. Chapter 1. Rules for Discipleship. As evidenced by several letters in this month's correspondence, a considerable number of individuals are seeking practical instruction in occultism. It therefore becomes imperative to articulate once and for all the essential distinction between theoretical and practical occultism, or what is broadly recognized as theosophy on the one hand and occult science on the other, as well as the nature of the difficulties inherent in the study of the latter. Becoming a theosophist is a relatively simple endeavor. Any individual possessing average intellectual faculties and a predilection for the metaphysical, who leads a pure and unselfish life, finding more profound joy in assisting their neighbor than in receiving aid, who remains perpetually willing to sacrifice personal pleasures for the benefit of others, and who venerates truth, goodness, and wisdom for their intrinsic value rather than for any advantage they might bestow, is a theosophist. However, it is an entirely different matter to embark upon the path that leads to the knowledge of right action and the accurate discernment between good and evil, a path that concurrently grants an individual the power to accomplish the good they desire, frequently without so much as ostensibly lifting a finger. Furthermore, there remains one crucial fact with which the student must be made acquainted, namely the immense, almost boundless responsibility assumed by the teacher on behalf of the pupil. From the spiritual teachers of the East who impart their wisdom openly or in secret, down to the handful of Kabbalists in Western lands who undertake to instruct their disciples in the rudiments of the sacred science, those Western hierophants frequently being unaware of the peril they court. Each and every one of these instructors is bound by the same inviolable law. From the very moment they genuinely commence their teaching, from the instant they bestow any power, be it psychic, mental, or physical, upon their pupils, they shoulder all the transgressions of that pupil concerning the occult sciences, whether those sins be of omission or commission, until the juncture at which initiation renders the pupil a master, thereby making them responsible in their own right. There exists an arcane and mystical religious law, highly revered and observed within the Greek Church, half forgotten in the Roman Catholic tradition, and entirely extinct within the Protestant Church. It dates back to the earliest epochs of Christianity and is founded upon the aforementioned law, serving as both its symbol and expression. This is the dogma concerning the absolute sanctity of the relationship between godparents who stand as sponsors for a child. They tacitly assume all the sins of the newly baptized infant until the day the child matures into an accountable entity, possessing the knowledge of good and evil. Thus, it becomes evident why these teachers exhibit such reticence, and why disciples are required to undergo a 7-year probation to demonstrate their aptitude and cultivate the qualities requisite for the security of both master and pupil. Occultism is not magic. It is comparatively facile to master the artifice of spells and the methodologies for manipulating the subtler, yet inherently material, forces of physical nature. The faculties of the animal soul within man are swiftly awakened, and the forces that his love, hatred, and passion can summon into operation are readily cultivated. However, this constitutes black magic or sorcery, for it is the motive and the motive alone that dictates whether any exercise of power manifests as black and malignant or white and beneficent magic. It is entirely impossible to command spiritual forces if even the faintest trace of selfishness remains within the practitioner. Unless the intention is completely unalloyed, the spiritual force will transmute into the psychic, operating upon the astral plane, and potentially yielding dire consequences. While the powers and forces of the animal nature may be utilized equally by the selfish and vindictive as by the selfless and all-forgiving, The powers and forces of the Spirit yield only to those who are perfectly pure in heart. This is the essence of divine magic. What, therefore, are the conditions required to become a student of the divine sapientia? Let it be known that no such instruction can conceivably be imparted unless these specific conditions are met and rigorously upheld throughout the years of study. This remains an indispensable prerequisite. No man can swim unless he wades into deep water. No bird can fly unless its wings have matured, possessing both the open expanse before it and the courage to entrust itself to the air. An individual who seeks to wield a two-edged sword must first become a consummate master of the blunt weapon, lest he injure himself or, worse still, others upon his initial attempt. To provide an approximate understanding of the sole conditions under which the study of divine wisdom may be pursued safely, that is, without the peril of the divine devolving into black magic, an excerpt is provided from the private rules furnished to every instructor in the East. The ensuing passages have been selected from a vast collection and are accompanied by explanatory brackets. The location selected for receiving instruction must be an environment expressly designed to avoid distracting the mind, populated exclusively with objects that evolve spiritual influence. Among other items, the 5 sacred colors, arranged in a circle, must be present. The space must remain entirely free of any malignant influences lingering in the atmosphere. Before the disciple is permitted to study face-to-face, he must acquire a preliminary understanding within a select company of other lay disciples, the total number of which must be odd. Before thou shalt impart to thy disciple the sacred words of the stages of the path, or permit him to prepare for initiation, thou shalt ensure that his mind is thoroughly purified and at peace with all things, most notably with his other selves. Otherwise, the words of wisdom and of the good law shall scatter and be carried away by the winds. The lay disciples, while engaged in study, must take meticulous care to remain as united as the fingers on a single hand. Thou shalt impress upon their minds that whatever causes suffering to one should cause suffering to all. If the rejoicing of one finds no resonant echo in the hearts of the others, then the requisite conditions are absent, and it is futile to proceed. The co-disciples must be tuned by the spiritual teacher like the strings of a lute, each distinct from the rest, yet every one emitting sounds in perfect harmony with the whole. Collectively, they must form a keyboard that responds in all its parts to thy lightest touch. Thus shall their minds open to the harmonies of wisdom, vibrating as knowledge through each and every one, thereby producing effects that are pleasing to the presiding gods and beneficial to the disciple. In this manner shall wisdom be forever inscribed upon their hearts, ensuring that the harmony of the law remains unbroken. Those who desire to attain the knowledge that leads to occult powers must unequivocally renounce all the vanities of life and of the secular world. No one can perceive a distinction between himself and his fellow students, harboring thoughts such as I am the wisest, or I am more holy and pleasing to the teacher or my community than my brother, and so forth, and still remain a true lay disciple. His thoughts must be predominantly anchored upon his heart, banishing from it every hostile sentiment directed toward any living creature. It must brim with the profound awareness of its non-separateness from the rest of sentient beings and from all of nature. Without this, no success can follow. A disciple must dread only external living influences. For this reason, while remaining at one with all things in his inner nature, he must take great care to insulate his outer body from every foreign influence. None must drink from or eat out of his cup save for himself. He must avoid bodily contact with both human and animal beings. The mind must remain impervious to all save the universal truths of nature, lest the doctrine of the heart degrade into mere doctrine of the eye. No animal food of any kind, indeed nothing that harbors life, should be consumed by the disciple. Neither wine, nor spirits, nor opium may be utilized. For these substances are akin to the malevolent entities that fasten themselves upon the unwary, utterly devouring one's understanding. Meditation, complete abstinence in all matters, the observance of moral duties, gentle thoughts, righteous deeds and kind words, alongside goodwill toward all and the absolute obliteration of the self, constitute the most efficacious means of attaining knowledge and preparing for the reception of higher wisdom. It is solely by virtue of a strict adherence to the aforementioned precepts that a Lanu may aspire to acquire in good time the cities of the Arhats, the spiritual maturation that enables him to gradually become one with the universal all. These 12 excerpts are drawn from a compilation of approximately 73 rules, the full enumeration of which would prove futile, for they would bear little significance within Europe. But even these few suffice to demonstrate the immensity of the difficulties which beset the path of the aspiring Upasaka, who has been born and reared in Western lands. All Western, and especially English, education is deeply imbued with the principles of emulation and strife, each youth being urged to learn with greater rapidity, to outstrip his companions, and to surpass them by every conceivable measure. That which is erroneously termed friendly rivalry is assiduously cultivated, and this selfsame spirit is nurtured and reinforced throughout every detail of life. With such ideologies ingrained within him from infancy, how might a Westerner bring himself to view his fellow students as intimately connected as the fingers upon a single hand? Those co-students, too, are not of his own selection, or chosen by himself through personal sympathy and mutual appreciation. They are selected by his instructor upon entirely different grounds, and he who endeavors to be a student must first possess the fortitude to eradicate from his heart all sentiments of aversion and antipathy toward others. How many Westerners stand prepared to even attempt this undertaking in earnest? And then the minutiae of daily existence, the solemn injunction against touching even the hand of one's closest and most cherished companion. How profoundly contrary to Western conceptions of affection and amiability. How extraordinarily cold and severe it appears. Egotistical, too, individuals would say, to abstain from imparting pleasure to others solely for the sake of one's personal development. Well, let those who harbor such beliefs defer, until a subsequent incarnation, the endeavor to embark upon this path in true earnestness. But let them not glory in their own imagined selflessness. For, in truth, it is merely superficial appearances which they permit to deceive them, the conventional notions, founded upon emotionalism and effusiveness, or so-called courtesy, these being the trappings of an illusory existence, not the dictates of truth. But even setting aside these difficulties, which may be deemed external, though their significance is by no means diminished, how are students within the West to attune themselves to the harmony as is here required of them? So dominant has individual personality become across Europe and America, that there exists scarcely a school of artists even whose members do not harbor mutual hatred and are not jealous of each other. Professional animosity and envy have grown proverbial. Men perpetually seek to benefit themselves at all costs, and even the ostensible courtesies of life remain but a hollow mask concealing these demons of hatred and jealousy. In the East, the spirit of non-separateness is inculcated as steadily from early childhood up, as in the West the spirit of rivalry. Personal ambition, personal sentiments and desires are not permitted to grow so rampantly there. When the soil is inherently fertile, it is cultivated appropriately, and the child matures into a man in whom the habitual subordination of one's lower nature to one's higher self remains steadfast and powerful. In the West, men presume that their personal affinities and aversions regarding other men and worldly matters serve as guiding principles for them to act upon, even when they refrain from establishing them as the absolute law of their lives and attempting to impose them upon others. Let those who lament having learned little within the Theosophical Society take to heart the profound words inscribed within an article in The Path from this preceding February. The vital key in each degree is the aspirant himself. It is not the fear of God which constitutes the beginning of wisdom, but the knowledge of the self which is wisdom itself. How magnificent and true appears, thus, to the student of occultism who has begun to apprehend some of the preceding truths, the answer bestowed by the Delphic oracle to all who came seeking after occult wisdom, words repeated and emphatically reinforced again and again by the wise Socrates. Man, know thyself. Cellaship bears no relation whatsoever to one's means of subsistence or anything of an analogous nature, for an individual possesses the capacity to entirely isolate his mind from his physical vessel and its environment. Cellaship represents an internal state of consciousness, rather than a life governed by rigid and uncompromising rules upon the physical plane. This applies most particularly to the initial, probationary period, whereas the regulations delineated in Lucifer this past April properly pertain to a more advanced stage, that of formal occult training and the cultivation of esoteric powers and insight. These dictates indicate, however, the mode of existence which ought to be pursued by all aspirants to the greatest practicable extent, as it proves exceedingly beneficial to them in their spiritual aspirations. It should never be forgotten that occultism is fundamentally concerned with the inner man who must be fortified and emancipated from the dominion of the corporeal body and its environs, which must become his obedient servants. Hence the foremost and paramount requisite of cellaship is a spirit of absolute selflessness and devotion to truth. Then follow self-knowledge and self-mastery. These virtues are of supreme importance, while the outward observance of inflexible lifestyle rules remains a matter of secondary significance. Helena Blavatsky, Chapter 2. True Wisdom versus Magic. I oft have heard, but ne'er believed till now, there are, who can by potent magic spells, bend to their crooked purpose nature's laws. Milton in this month's correspondence several letters testify to the profound impression produced upon certain minds by our preceding article Practical Occultism. Such letters serve extensively to substantiate and reinforce two logical conclusions. There are more well-educated and contemplative men who believe in the existence of occultism and magic than the modern materialist dreams of, and that most of the believers possess no definitive conception regarding the true nature of occultism and frequently conflate it with the occult sciences at large, the black art included. Their depictions of the powers it bestows upon humanity, and of the methods required for their acquisition are as diverse as they are fanciful. Some imagine that a master of the art, simply to illuminate the path, is all that is required to become a Zanoni. Others, that one has merely to traverse the Suez Canal and journey to India in order to blossom forth as a Roger Bacon or even a Count Saint-Germain. Many adopt as their ideal Margrave with his perpetually renewing youth, and care little for the soul as the price exacted for it. Not a few egregiously mistaking witch-vendorism pure and simple for occultism, through the yawning earth from Stygian gloom, summon the meager ghost into the walks of light, and desire, upon the strength of this singular feat, to be heralded as fully realized adepts. Ceremonial magic, according to the dictates mockingly laid down by Eliphaz Levi, represents another imagined alter ego of the ancient philosophy of the Arhats of old. In short, the prisms through which occultism is perceived, to those innocent of its philosophy, remain as vividly multicolored and varied as human imagination can possibly render them. Will these candidates to wisdom and power feel deeply indignant if presented with the unvarnished truth? It is not merely useful, but has now become an absolute necessity to disabuse the majority of them, and before it is exceedingly late. This truth may be articulated in but a few words. There do not exist in the West even half a dozen among the fervent hundreds who style themselves occultists, who possess even an approximately accurate comprehension of the nature of the science they endeavor to master. With a few exceptions, they are all traversing the highway toward sorcery. Let them establish a semblance of order within the chaos that presently reigns in their minds, before they protest against this assertion. Let them first discern the true relationship in which the occult sciences stand to occultism, and the fundamental distinction between the two, and then feel wrathful if they still deem themselves to be in the right. In the interim, let them understand that occultism diverges from magic and other secret sciences precisely as the resplendent sun differs from a mere rushlight. As the immutable and immortal spirit of man, the reflection of the absolute, causeless, and unknowable all, diverges from the mortal clay of the human body. In our highly civilized West, where modern languages have evolved and words have been coined in the wake of emerging ideas and thoughts, as has occurred with every tongue, the more these concepts became materialized within the cold atmosphere of Western selfishness and its incessant pursuit of worldly goods, the less necessity was perceived for the creation of new terminology to articulate that which was tacitly dismissed as absolute and exploded superstition. Such vocabulary could correspond only to concepts that a cultured individual was scarcely expected to harbor in his mind. Magic, regarded as a synonym for jugglery, sorcery, considered an equivalent for crass ignorance, and occultism, deemed the lamentable relic of deluded medieval fire philosophers, of the Jacob Boehmes and the St. Martins, are expressions believed more than amply sufficient to encompass the entire domain of chicanery. They are terms of contempt, generally employed only in reference to the dross and residue of the Dark Ages and the preceding eons of paganism. Consequently, we lack the terminology within the English tongue to define and nuance the distinctions among such abnormal powers, or the sciences that precipitate their acquisition, with the precision achievable in Eastern languages, preeminently Sanskrit. What do the words miracle and enchantment convey to the minds of those who hear or pronounce them? A Christian, notwithstanding the implied violation of the laws of nature, while believing firmly in miracles because they are said to have been wrought by God through Moses, will either dismiss the enchantments performed by Pharaoh's magicians or attribute them to the devil. It is the latter entity whom our pious adversaries associate with occultism, whereas their impious foes, the infidels, mock Moses, magicians, and occultists alike, and would blush to give a single serious thought to such superstitions. This occurs because there exists no terminology to delineate the distinction, no vocabulary to articulate the lights and shadows, nor to draw the line of demarcation between the sublime and the true, and the absurd and the ridiculous. The latter comprise theological interpretations that posit the fracturing of nature's laws by man, God, or devil. The former encompass the scientific miracles and enchantments of Moses and the magicians, enacted in accordance with natural laws, as both parties had been instructed in all the wisdom of the sanctuaries, which functioned as the royal societies of antiquity, and in true occultism. This final term is undeniably misleading, translated as it stands from the compound expression Guptavidya, or secret knowledge. Yet knowledge of what precisely? Certain Sanskrit terms may provide elucidation. There are 4 designations for the various classifications of esoteric knowledge or sciences provided, even within the exoteric Puranas. First is Yajnavidya, the knowledge of the occult powers awakened in nature through the performance of specific religious ceremonies and rites. Next is Mahavidya, the great knowledge, the magic of the Kabbalists and Tantric worship, frequently constituting sorcery of the most malignant description. Then follows Guhyavidya, the knowledge of the mystic powers residing in sound and ether, thus within the mantras, contingent upon the rhythm and melody employed. In other words, a magical enactment founded upon the knowledge of the forces of nature and their correlation. Finally, there is Atmavidya, a term simply translated as knowledge of the soul or true wisdom by Orientalists, yet which signifies profoundly more. This last represents the sole form of occultism that any theosophist who reveres light on the path, and who aspires to be both wise and unselfish, ought to pursue. All the remainder constitute various branches of the occult sciences, arts predicated upon the knowledge of the ultimate essence of all things within the kingdoms of nature, such as minerals, plants, and animals. They pertain, therefore, to the realm of material nature, however invisible that essence may be, and regardless of how thoroughly it has hitherto eluded the grasp of science. Alchemy, astrology, occult physiology, and chiromancy exist within nature, and the exact sciences, perhaps so termed because, in this age of paradoxical philosophies, they frequently prove to be the reverse, have already uncovered a considerable number of the secrets belonging to the aforementioned arts. However, clairvoyance, symbolized in India as the eye of Shiva and referred to in Japan as infinite vision, is not hypnotism, the illegitimate offspring of mesmerism, nor is it to be acquired through such practices. All the other disciplines may be mastered and results obtained, whether benevolent, malevolent, or indifferent, but Atmavidya places little value upon them. It encompasses them all and may occasionally employ them, yet it does so only after purifying them of their dross for beneficent purposes, taking meticulous care to excise every element of selfish motivation. Let us elucidate this further. Any man or woman may undertake the study of one or all of the aforementioned occult arts without extensive prior preparation, and even without adopting an overly restrictive mode of life. One might even dispense with any elevated standard of morality. In the latter scenario, naturally, the overwhelming probability is that the student would evolve into a remarkably proficient sorcerer, plunging headlong into black magic. Yet, of what consequence is this? The voodoos and Dugpa eat, drink, and make merry over hecatombs of victims claimed by their infernal arts, as do the amiable gentlemen vivisectionists and the credentialed hypnotists of the faculties of medicine, the sole distinction between the two classes being that the voodoos and Dugpa are conscious sorcerers, whereas the Charcatrichet faction are unconscious ones. Thus, since both must eventually reap the fruits of their labors and achievements in the black arts, the Western practitioners ought not to endure the punishment and infamy without also reaping the profits and enjoyments they might derive therefrom. For we iterate once more, hypnotism and vivisection, as practiced in such institutions, constitute sorcery pure and simple, merely lacking the esoteric knowledge that the voodoos and Dugpa command, knowledge which no Charcot Richer could procure for himself through 50 years of arduous study and empirical observation. Let those, therefore, who insist upon dabbling in magic, whether they comprehend its true nature or not, but who find the disciplines imposed upon students excessively rigorous, and who consequently cast Atmavidya or occultism aside, proceed without it. Let them become magicians by all means, even if they destine themselves to be voodoos and dugpa for the subsequent 10 incarnations. But the interest of our readers will likely center upon those who find themselves irresistibly drawn toward the occult, yet who neither comprehend the true nature of their aspirations nor have rendered themselves impervious to passion, much less become genuinely unselfish. What is to become of these unfortunate individuals, we shall be asked, who are thus rent asunder by conflicting forces? For it has been stated too frequently to require repetition, and the fact itself is readily apparent to any observer, that once the desire for occultism has truly awakened within a person's heart, there remains for him no hope of peace, nor any place of rest and comfort in all the world. He is driven out into the wild and desolate expanses of life by an ever-gnawing unrest he cannot quell. His heart being too replete with passion and selfish desire to permit his passage through the Golden Gate, he is unable to find tranquility or peace in ordinary existence. Must he then inevitably descend into sorcery and black magic, thereby accumulating a terrible karma over the course of many incarnations? Is there no alternative path available to him? Indeed there is, we answer. Let him aspire to no loftier an objective than he feels capable of accomplishing. Let him refrain from assuming a burden too ponderous for him to bear. Without ever becoming a Mahatma, a Buddha, or a great saint, let him study the philosophy and the science of the soul, and he may emerge as one of the modest benefactors of humanity, entirely bereft of superhuman powers. Cities are reserved exclusively for those capable of leading the prescribed life, of submitting to the formidable sacrifices necessitated by such training, and of fulfilling them to the strictest letter. Let them be apprised immediately and remember perpetually that true occultism or theosophy constitutes the great renunciation of self, unconditionally and absolutely, in both thought and action. It is altruism, and it removes him who practices it entirely from the reckoning of the ranks of the living. Not for himself, but for the world, he lives, as soon as he has committed himself to the endeavor. Much is forgiven during the initial years of probation, but no sooner is he accepted than his personality must vanish, and he is compelled to become a solely beneficent force in nature. There remain but two poles for him thereafter, two paths, and no intermediate place of rest. He must either ascend laboriously, step by step, frequently through numerous incarnations without a devachanic break, the golden ladder culminating in Mahatmaship, or he will permit himself to slide down the ladder at the initial misstep and plummet into Dugbaship. All this is either unknown or omitted from consideration altogether. Indeed, an observer capable of tracing the silent evolution of the candidate's preliminary aspirations often discovers peculiar notions quietly taking possession of their minds. There are those whose faculties of reason have been so distorted by extraneous influences that they imagine animal passions may be so sublimated and elevated that their fury, force, and fire can, so to speak, be directed inwards, that they may be accumulated and confined within one's breast, until their energy is, not expended, but diverted toward higher and more sacred purposes. Namely, until their collective and unexpended potency empowers their possessor to enter the true sanctuary of the soul and stand therein in the presence of the Master, the higher self. To achieve this purpose, they will neither struggle against their passions nor annihilate them. They will simply, through a formidable exertion of will, suppress the fierce flames and hold them at bay within their natures, permitting the fire to smolder beneath a thin veneer of ashes. They submit joyfully to the torment of the Spartan youth who permitted the fox to devour his entrails rather than relinquish it. Oh, pitiful blind visionaries! One might equally hope that a band of inebriated chimney sweeps, overheated and grimy from their labor, could be confined within a sanctuary draped with pure white linen, and that rather than soiling and reducing it by their presence into a heap of filthy shreds, they would become masters in and of the sacred recess, ultimately emerging from it as immaculate as the recess itself. Why not imagine that a dozen skunks, imprisoned within the pristine atmosphere of a gonpa, might emerge from it permeated with all the fragrances of the incenses utilized therein? Strange aberration of the human mind! Can it be so? Let us reason upon the matter. The master within the sanctuary of our souls is the higher self, the divine spirit whose consciousness is founded upon and derived exclusively from the mind, which we have agreed to designate as the human soul. In its turn, the former is a compound in its highest manifestation of spiritual aspirations, volitions, and divine love, and in its baser aspects, of animal desires and terrestrial passions imparted to it through its association with its vehicle, the repository of all these. It thereby stands as a link and an intermediary between the animal nature of man which its higher reason endeavors to subdue, and his divine spiritual nature to which it gravitates, whenever it secures the upper hand in its conflict with the inner animal. The latter represents the instinctual animal soul and serves as the breeding ground for those passions, which, as previously demonstrated, are pacified rather than eradicated, and sequestered within their breasts by certain imprudent enthusiasts. Do they yet hope thereby to transmute the muddied stream of the animal sewer into the crystalline waters of life? And where, upon what neutral ground, might they be imprisoned so as not to contaminate man? The fierce passions of love and lust remain alive, and they are permitted to linger in the place of their inception, that very animal soul, for both the higher and the lower faculties of the human soul or mind repudiate such inmates, though they cannot avoid being tainted by their proximity as neighbors. The higher self or spirit is as incapable of assimilating such sentiments as water is of mingling with oil or impure liquid tallow. It is therefore the mind alone, the solitary link and medium between the terrestrial man and the higher self, that bears the soul's suffering, and which remains in the incessant peril of being dragged down by those passions that might reawaken at any given moment, and perish in the abyss of matter. And how can it ever attune itself to the divine harmony of the supreme principle, when that harmony is shattered by the mere presence, within the sanctuary under preparation, of such bestial passions? How might harmony prevail and triumph, when the soul is sullied and distracted by the tumult of passions and the terrestrial cravings of the bodily senses, or even of the astral man? For this astral, the shadowy double, is not the companion of the divine ego but of the earthly body. It forms the link between the personal self, the lower consciousness of Manas, and the body, and is the vehicle of transitory, not of immortal life. Like the shadow cast by a man, it slavishly and mechanically follows his movements and impulses, and leans therefore toward matter without ever ascending to spirit. It is only when the power of the passions is entirely extinguished, and when they have been crushed and annihilated within the crucible of an unflinching will, when not only all the lusts and longings of the flesh have perished, but also the recognition of the personal self has been eradicated and the astral has consequently been reduced to a mere cipher, that the union with the higher self can take place. Then when the astral reflects merely the conquered man, the still living but no longer yearning selfish personality, then the brilliant ogoids, the divine self, may vibrate in conscious harmony with both poles of the human entity, the purified man of matter, and the ever-pure spiritual soul, and stand in the presence of the Master Self, the Christos of the mystic Gnostic, blended, merged into, and entirely one with it forever. How then can it be considered possible for a man to enter the narrow gate of occultism when his daily and hourly thoughts are entangled with worldly matters, desires of possession and power, with lust, ambition, and duties, which, however honorable, remain inherently of the earthy? Even the love of wife and family, the purest as the most unselfish of human affections, constitutes a barrier to genuine occultism. For whether we examine the holy love of a mother for her child, or that of a husband for his wife, even within these sentiments, when analyzed to their very foundation and thoroughly sifted, there remains a degree of selfishness in the first and a mutual selfishness in the second instance. What mother would not sacrifice without a moment's hesitation hundreds and thousands of lives for that of the child of her heart? And what lover or true husband would not shatter the happiness of every other man and woman around him to satisfy the desire of the one whom he loves? This is merely natural, we shall be told. Quite so in the light of the code of human affections, less so in that of divine universal love. For, while the heart remains consumed with thoughts for a diminutive group of selves, near and dear to us, how shall the remainder of mankind fare within our souls? What measure of love and care will remain to be bestowed upon the great orphan? And how shall the still small voice make itself heard within a soul entirely occupied with its own privileged tenets? What room is there left for the seeds of humanity as a whole to impress themselves upon, or even receive a swift response? And yet, he who would profit by the wisdom of the universal mind must attain it through the entirety of humanity without distinction of race, complexion, religion, or social status. It is altruism, rather than egoism even in its most legitimate and noble conception, that can lead the individual unit to merge its lesser self into the universal selves. It is to these necessities and to this endeavor that the true disciple of occultism must devote himself, should he wish to attain theosophy, divine wisdom, and knowledge. The aspirant must choose absolutely between the worldly life and the life of occultism. It is both futile and vain to endeavor to unite the two, for no individual can serve two masters and satisfy both. One cannot serve both his physical body and his higher soul, nor fulfill both his familial and universal duties, without depriving one or the other of its rightful due. For he will either lend his ear to the still, small voice and fail to hear the cries of his kin, or he will attend solely to the needs of the latter and remain deaf to the voice of humanity. It would prove a ceaseless and maddening struggle for almost any married man who seeks to pursue true, practical occultism rather than its mere theoretical philosophy. For he would find himself perpetually hesitating between the voice of the impersonal, divine love of humanity and that of personal, terrestrial affection. And this could inevitably lead only to his failing in one or the other, or perhaps in both of his duties. Worse than this, for whoever, having pledged himself to occultism, indulges in the gratification of terrestrial love or lust, must suffer an almost immediate consequence, that of being irresistibly dragged from the impersonal, divine state down to the lower plane of matter. Sensual and even mental self-gratification entails the immediate loss of the powers of spiritual discernment. The voice of the master can no longer be distinguished from that of one's passions or even that of a dugpa, nor right from wrong, nor sound morality from mere casuistry. The Dead Sea fruit assumes the most glorious mystic appearance, only to turn to ashes upon their lips and to gall within the heart, resulting in depth ever deepening, darkness darkening still, folly for wisdom, guilt for innocence, anguish for rapture, and for hope despair. And once mistaken and having acted upon their errors, the majority of men shrink from recognizing their transgression, and thus descend ever deeper into the mire. And, although it is intention that primarily dictates whether white or black magic is exercised, the consequences of even involuntary, unconscious sorcery cannot fail to be productive of adverse karma. Sufficient has been said to demonstrate that sorcery constitutes any form of malevolent influence exerted upon others, who suffer or cause others to suffer as a consequence. Karma is a heavy stone plunged into the tranquil waters of life, and it must invariably produce ever-widening circles of ripples, carried further and further, almost ad infinitum. Such causes, once generated, must call forth effects, and these are manifested in the just laws of retribution. Much of this may be circumvented if individuals would merely abstain from rushing into practices of which they understand neither the nature nor the significance. No one is expected to bear a burden exceeding his strength and capacities. There are natural-born magicians, mystics and occultists by birth, who possess this standing by right of direct inheritance from a series of incarnations and eons of suffering and failures. These individuals are, so to speak, impervious to passion. No fires of earthly origin can fan their senses into flame. No human voice can elicit a response within their souls, save for the great cry of humanity. These alone may be assured of success. Yet, they are encountered but rarely, and they pass through the narrow gates of occultism because they bear no personal baggage of transitory human sentiments. They have divested themselves of the feelings of the lower personality, thereby paralyzing the astral animal, and the golden, albeit narrow, gate is thrown open before them. Such is not the case for those who must yet bear, for several incarnations, the burden of sins committed in previous lives, and even in their present existence. For such individuals, unless they proceed with profound caution, the golden gate of wisdom may transform into the wide gate and the broad path that leadeth unto destruction, and therefore many be they that enter in thereby. This is the gate of the occult arts, practiced for selfish motives and in the absence of the restraining and beneficent influence of Atmavidya. We currently reside in the Kali Yuga, and its fatal influence is 1,000-fold more potent in the West than in the East. Hence the easy prey claimed by the powers of the Age of Darkness in this cyclic struggle, and the multitude of delusions under which the world now labors. Chief among these is the relative facility with which men fancy they can approach the gate and cross the threshold of occultism without any profound sacrifice. This is the dream of the majority of theosophists, one inspired by a desire for power and personal selfishness. Yet, such sentiments can never lead them to the coveted goal. For, as was eloquently spoken by one believed to have sacrificed himself for humanity, narrow is the gate and straitened the way that leadeth unto life eternal, and therefore few be they that find it. So constricted is it, indeed, that at the mere mention of certain preliminary difficulties, the affrighted Western candidates turn back and retreat with a shudder. Let them pause here and attempt nothing further in their profound weakness. For if, whilst turning their backs upon the narrow gate, they are dragged by their craving for the occult a single step toward the broad and more inviting gates of that golden mystery which glitters in the light of illusion, woe unto them. It can lead only to Dugbyship, and they will assuredly find themselves very soon deposited upon that via fatale, over whose portal Dante read the words, "Through me one goes into the city of woe. Through me one goes into eternal pain. Through me one goes among the lost people." Chapter 3. Dangers of Revealing Secrets. A prominent public lecturer and distinguished Egyptologist uttered, in one of his lectures opposing the teachings of Theosophy, a few suggestive words, which are herein quoted and must be addressed. It is a delusion to presume that there exists anything in the experience or wisdom of the past, the ascertained results of which can only be communicated from beneath the cloak and mask of mystery. Explanation is the soul of science. They will assert that we cannot acquire their knowledge without living their life. Public experimental research, the printing press, and a platform of free thought have abolished the necessity for mystery. It is no longer necessary for science to don the veil, as she was compelled to do for the sake of security in times past. This constitutes a highly mistaken view in one aspect. Secrets pertaining to a purer and more profound life not only may, but must, be made universally known. However, there are secrets that kill within the arcana of occultism, and unless a man truly lives the life, he cannot be entrusted with them. The late Professor Faraday harbored grave doubts regarding whether it was entirely wise and reasonable to disseminate certain discoveries of modern science to the general public. Chemistry had precipitated the invention of means of destruction far too terrible in our century to permit them to fall into the hands of the profane. What man of sense, when confronted with such fiendish applications of dynamite and other explosive substances as are perpetrated by those incarnations of the destroying power, who glory in styling themselves anarchists and socialists, would not agree with us in saying, "Far better for mankind that it should never have blasted a single rock by modern perfected means, than that it should have shattered the limbs of even 1% of those who have thus been destroyed by the pitiless hands of Russian nihilists, Irish Fenians, and anarchists. That such discoveries, and principally their murderous applications, ought to have been withheld from public knowledge may be demonstrated on the authority of statistics and commissions appointed to investigate and record the consequences of the evil done. The ensuing information, gleaned from public records, will provide insight into what may await wretched humanity. England alone, the very nucleus of civilization, possesses 21,268 firms engaged in the fabrication and sale of explosive substances. However, the principal epicenters of the dynamite trade, of infernal machines, and of other such byproducts of modern civilization, are situated chiefly in Philadelphia and New York. It is within the former city of brotherly love that the most renowned manufacturer of explosives currently flourishes. A well-known and ostensibly respectable citizen, the inventor and manufacturer of the most murderous dynamite toys, who, when summoned before a United States Senate anxious to adopt measures for the repression of excessively free trade in such implements, articulated an argument that ought to be immortalized for its cynical sophistry. "My machines," that expert is reported to have stated, "are entirely innocuous in appearance, as they may be manufactured in the shape of oranges, hats, boats, or indeed anything one might desire. The criminal is he who murders people by means of such devices, not he who manufactures them." The firm refuses to concede that, in the absence of a supply, There would be no incentive for market demand, insisting instead that every demand ought to be satisfied by a readily available supply. Such a supply is the fruit of civilization and of the publicity accorded to the discovery of every murderous property inherent in matter. What does this entail? According to the report of the commission appointed to investigate the variety and character of these so-called infernal machines, the following implements of instantaneous human destruction are already available. The most fashionable among the myriad varieties fabricated by Mr. Holgate are the ticker, the 8-day machine, the little exterminator, and the bottle machine. In appearance, the ticker resembles a piece of lead, measuring a foot in length and 4 inches in thickness. It contains an iron or steel tube filled with a specific variety of gunpowder invented by Holgate himself. This gunpowder, though visually indistinguishable from any ordinary substance bearing that name, possesses an explosive power 200 times greater than that of standard gunpowder. Thus, the ticker contains a powder equivalent in force to 200 pounds of common gunpowder. Affixed to one end of the device is a concealed clockwork mechanism designed to regulate the timing of the explosion, which may be set to detonate anywhere from 1 minute to 36 hours in advance. The spark is generated by means of a steel needle that ignites at the touch hole, thereby communicating the fire to the entire apparatus. The 8-day machine is considered the most powerful, yet simultaneously the most complicated, of all the devices thus far invented. One must be intimately familiar with its operation before complete success can be assured. It is owing to this very difficulty that the terrible fate intended for London Bridge and its vicinity was averted, resulting instead in the instantaneous demise of the 2 Fenian criminals. The dimensions and appearance of that machine alter, Proteus-like, in accordance with the necessity of smuggling it into an area by various means, remaining entirely unperceived by the intended victims. It may be concealed within a loaf of bread, a basket of oranges, a liquid, and so forth. The commission of experts is reported to have declared that its explosive potency is sufficient to instantaneously reduce the largest edifice in the world to atoms. The little exterminator is an innocent-looking, unassuming utensil fashioned in the shape of a modest jug. It contains neither dynamite nor powder, but rather secretes a deadly gas. Furthermore, it features a scarcely perceptible clockwork mechanism attached to its edge, the needle of which indicates the precise moment the gas will effect its escape. In an enclosed room, this new, lethal form of vril will nearly instantaneously asphyxiate every living being within a distance of 100 feet, which constitutes the radius of this murderous jug. With these 3 latest novelties, produced during the high season of Christian civilization, the catalogue of the dynamiters is concluded. All remaining devices belong to the antiquated fashions of past years. These consist of hats, cigar cases, bottles of an ordinary nature, and even ladies-smelling bottles filled with dynamite, nitroglycerin, etc., weapons, some of which, unconsciously adhering to karmic law, killed many of the dynamiters during the last Chicago Revolution. Add to this the forthcoming and long-promised vibratory force of Keeley, capable of reducing a dead bullock to a heap of ashes in a mere matter of seconds, and then ask yourself whether Dante's Inferno, as a locality, could ever rival the earth in the production of such hellish engines of destruction. Thus, if purely material implements are capable of obliterating the greatest cities of the globe from but a few corners, provided these murderous weapons are guided by expert hands, what terrible dangers might arise should magical occult secrets be revealed and allowed to fall into the possession of malicious individuals. These are 1,000 times more dangerous and lethal, for neither the criminal hand nor the immaterial, invisible weapon employed can ever be detected. congenital black magicians, those who unite an innate propensity for evil with highly developed mediumistic natures, are all too numerous in our present age. It is high time, therefore, that psychologists and believers, at the very least, should cease advocating the virtues of publicity and demanding that the secrets of nature be made known to all. It is certainly not in our era of suggestion and explosives that occultism can cast wide the doors of its lab. Do you want access to this and all the complete audiobooks on the channel, plus the ebook version? Click the link in the description or scan the QR code in the left corner of the screen to access our library, where you can listen to your favorite esoteric books without ad interruptions, lock your screen, or use other apps while the narration plays, and even download the ebook version to follow along as you listen. Listen on your computer via web browser, or download the app from the Play Store. After subscribing, you will receive an email with your login details, password, and step-by-step instructions on how to access the books through the Hotmart app.